So we're going to start by talking about a topic in machine learning and data science called dimensionality reduction. So I want to talk about this because it's a very neat technique for machine learning, and it is also it has some techniques that are very much based on ideas about graph theory. So we will talk about all that in time, but let's start with talking about what is any of this at all. So dimensionality reduction is a machine learning technique for visualizing or even sort of processing and doing, learning stuff on data in high dimensions. Or let me say high dimensional data. And the way that you visualize this, or a thing that has other applications even apart from visualizing it, is you do this by finding a representation for this data, by representing it in low dimensions. So that's why it's called dimensionality reduction. It's basically you're taking some data, which is very high dimensional, and you are representing it after, reducing the number of dimensions. So first of all, what do we mean? What kind of things are we talking about with very high dimensional data? Well, for example, there is a famous data set that's often used in machine learning called the MNIST digits. This is an acronym for something. I think it stands for Modified National Institute of Standards and Technology Dataset, but you don't need to know that. MNIST is what everyone calls it. And MNIST digits are, it's a data set of handwritten digits, so images of handwritten digits. That's often used for machine learning and maybe especially, but not limited to, computer vision type problems. So this is an example of an image in the data set. It's a handwritten digit 2. And each image is 28 by 28 pixels. So that's 784 pixels total. And what that means is each point in this data set, which is an image like this, each point has 784 coordinates. So this data is 784 dimensional. And that is not a very easy thing to visualize, 784 dimensions. That's the point of dimensionality reduction, is can we take this data and represent it in 2 or 3 dimensions with preserving as much structure as possible. So let me give an idea of what I mean by that as well. What does it mean to preserve the structure of the data when you're taking a lower dimensional representation? So the goal of dimensionality reduction, let me say it again, is to represent, is to find, I'm going to be a little bit vague about what I mean by this, but a good representation of data in lower dimensions. So for example, let me try to draw a picture to illustrate what this means. I'm not going to draw a 784-dimensional picture, but I'm going to draw a 3-dimensional picture and then reduce it to 2 dimensions, just to give an idea for what all this might mean. So here is a 3-dimensional box. And let's suppose our data, so I'm going to draw, it's going to be kind of cartoonish. But let's say we have this like sort of rolled up sheet, and let's also cut a little rectangle in it, like that. So maybe you can see the rectangle a little bit down here. So this is, we can think of this, we can imagine this as being some data. So our data points are going to be like points on this sheet, etc. And we want to represent this in lower dimensions, meaning in this case 2 dimensions. And you can see that if you, for example, just project downwards, you're going to get kind of a mess. It's just going to look like a blob. And data points that are far away, like up here and down here, are going to look very close together. So that is not what you want. Which is to say that, you know, just projecting down in one coordinate is sort of a very naive and not very good way of doing this. What you want is some kind of nonlinear thing that will unroll the sheet and it will come out looking like this. So for example, this data point would correspond to a point over here, and this data point would correspond to a point sort of over here, etc. So our data is on this sort of cutout rectangle. So this is the idea of dimensionality reduction. You want to reduce the number of dimensions, but preserve the structure of the data. Now, there are 2 main areas, or 2 main types of dimensionality reduction sort of techniques. And they are matrix factorization and neighbor graphs. And neighbor graphs is the type that I want to talk about. So the basic idea of the neighbor graphs style is basically, it's an idea about how to represent the structure of your data in a way that is agnostic of dimension. So the idea is to capture the structure of data by turning it into a graph. And basically the content of, you know, how you design your algorithm and how you design your technique for dimensionality reduction comes into how do you turn it into a graph. So I'm not going to get super technical about that because you can get extremely technical, and that's I don't know much about it. But the idea is basically you want to draw edges between points that are close together. And by doing so, you turn your data into a graph. So let me try to draw a picture of this. These pictures, you know, this picture is going to be harder, but let's give it a good old shot. So I'm going to, let me consult my notes to attempt to do some kind of good job. So I'm going to draw some data points that are labeled A through L, I think, but I'm going to draw them out of order so that I can follow my notes and try to do a good job. So basically we have some data. It's like scattered around in 3 dimensions. And we want to try and capture some of the structure by drawing edges, forming it into a graph by drawing edges between points that are close to each other. So these points are close to each other. These are close. I'm actually going to say that all of these 4 points are very close to each other. And then so on. We get something like this. So we have formed a graph out of our data. And then the idea is that we find a good representation in lower dimensions by looking for an arrangement that produces a similar graph. So what do we mean by this? The idea is that if we have some arrangement of our points in a lower dimensional space, let me again draw one of those. Okay, let me zoom out a little bit. I think I want a bigger box. So A, B, C, D, F, L. So here is just some arrangement of the same data in 2 dimensions. We can do the same idea. We can draw a graph out of this data by connecting data points that are close to each other. And we can get a graph out of it. And then we look at how similar this graph is to this graph. And in this case, since our points are labeled, we're not looking for an abstract isomorphism. We're looking for example, the point A in this graph is connected to B, C, and D. And how similar is that in this graph? The point A is connected to J and F. So that's completely different. Not a very good job. Let's just check another point for good measure. G is connected to E, K, and H in this graph. In this graph, G is connected to E, K and H are all the way over here. So there is a little bit of overlap, but again, not very good at all. So this is what we would call, this is how we measure how good a representation of our data we've got. So this is a pretty bad representation. On the other hand, if we draw something like oh geez. So if we have some representation like this, and we do the same thing and draw edges between points that are close together, how good is this representation of our data? Well, in this case, we look at A, and it's connected to F and J. And in this graph, A is also connected to F and J. So it matches exactly. That's what we want. We might have a little bit of discrepancy. Like in this graph, B is connected to L and C. And in this graph, B is connected to L and C and J. So it's not perfect, but it's still, you can see it's pretty close. So we didn't miss by too much. This is a good representation. And basically, the idea is that having this way of determining how good a representation is allows us to learn a good representation. So that's basically some machine learning stuff that I'm going to leave under the hood. But the idea is essentially that now that you have this process for checking how good a representation of your data is, you can basically keep adjusting it to make it better and better and better. And that is how you learn a good representation, which is to say that is how you represent your data in lower dimensions. So this is the idea of the neighbor graphs style of dimensionality reduction. And this is the idea basically the idea behind the, this is the very basic idea behind many of the state-of-the-art algorithms, techniques for doing this. So one of those that I want to introduce you to is such as TSNE, which stands for, again, maybe you don't need to worry too much about what the name is, but it stands for T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding. So it gives you a clue in the name that it's a neighbor graphs style algorithm. And I want to give an example of TSNE applied to this MNIST digits dataset that I introduced at the beginning. So you'll remember that we have this dataset which consists of 28 by 28 pixel images. So it's 784 dimensional. And the idea is that dimensionality reduction should allow us to represent this data in just 2 or 3 dimensions, trying to preserve as much of the structure as possible. So we're going to go on a field trip to good old Google Colab. So here is, okay, this is just me, importing TSNE and running it. So here I have my MNIST dataset that I'm loading in and basically cleaning up the data. Here we are, there's this TSNE thing, and we are just performing TSNE on our dataset. And here we are telling iPlot to plot it nicely for us. And this is the result. So you can see we have plotted this data in 2 dimensions, and we have colored each point corresponding to the digit that it represents. And you can see that TSNE has done a very good job of keeping the structure of this data in this lower dimensional representation, in the sense that it made a little cluster for each different digit. So for example, if you look at the legend on the right-hand side, it looks like 0 is colored blue. So it's the cluster at the top right-hand corner is all the data points that are handwritten digit 0. And similarly, the digits 1 are shown in orange, and those form the big cluster at the bottom. And a couple of things to note about this, you can see that it's not perfect, but it did quite a good job. And also, I would like to emphasize that when we gave the data to TSNE to learn a low dimensional embedding of it, we did not tell it the true values for each digit. So it found these clusters on its own. We only colored them later to so that we could tell what we're looking at. So this is an example of unsupervised learning, where you're finding structure in the data without even having been told what to look for. So you give TSNE just some random data, and it decides that here are some clusters of data that are related to each other. This is one of the really cool things that you can do with dimensionality reduction, and very much based on the idea of graph theory.